we've been having a chat around all the uncertainty around the LSAT situation this year. But I also know there's a lot going on with the law school situation that they're pretty uncertain as well with regard to what's going to happen. How are you seeing them being impacted by coronavirus in terms of moving things online for those especially starting in the fall? But before that, just share a little bit about your background and what you do.
I teach at the University of Colorado Law School. I've been there for 30 years. I write a lot about higher education in general and legal education in particular. I wrote a book about 7, 8 years ago now called Don't Go to Law School Unless, which is an advice guide for people considering going to law school. And that's the kind of work that I do, at least in this area. So to address your questions, I think there's obviously a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now as to what's going to be happening in the fall. I think there are two different considerations that are kind of cutting in opposite directions. The one is that higher education historically is what's known as countercyclical economically. In other words, when economic times are tough, generally people tend to go back to school because the opportunity cost of going to school is lower than it would be otherwise. And it does look like we're now into a very considerable recession probably for the next at least few months. On the other hand, the big question, as you are implying, is it's very unclear whether people are going to be willing to pay anything like full price tuition for essentially distance learning on a mass scale. And since we don't know yet whether we're going to be able to have in-person classes yet in the fall, that creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to what's going to be happening with enrollment, both in law schools, but also in higher education in general.
Wow. Yeah. So it sounds like, if anything, law schools may have more reason to be stressed out right now than students, as they deal with students who may not want to pay the same amount. I actually did a poll in the LSAT Unplugged Facebook community earlier today asking, would you pay the same amount for online law school as compared to in person? And the overwhelming majority said they would not pay the same amount. They would pay much less.
Yeah, that's not surprising, and that's the kind of stuff that university administrators are looking at. And so right now we're in a position of great uncertainty. We pretty much every law school in the country went to distance learning a couple, 3 weeks ago. We had to do it all of a sudden. Almost everyone who had to do it didn't really have any background in doing it. So it was a far from optimal situation, to put it mildly. On the other hand, it was obviously a triage kind of measure. It's something we had to do something. It's the midst of an emergency. Of course, it's a completely different situation in the fall when people have had 6 months to think about what do they want to do, what are they willing to pay for. Are they going to wait for regular legal education to come back? And then underlying all of this is yet another question, which is what kinds of really big long-term structural changes are going to be produced by this crisis. Because one thing that happens in the history of pandemics is that basic social changes are driven by such things. So in other words, a movement towards a much broader use of distance learning may actually be greatly accelerated by what has happened and what is happening right now over the course of this crisis. So there's just all kinds of really interesting questions. For law schools, these questions are interesting in the Chinese proverb sense of interesting, right? Which is, the curse of may you live in interesting times. I would not want to be a law school dean right now. A lot of budgets are teetering on the brink already, and what may happen in the fall could push a lot of people over. So, we in legal academia right now are just extremely uncertain about how things are going to shake out.
Yeah, no, I think everyone's uncertain right now, but law schools have special reason to be concerned because they have all this overhead based on a physical location. That new student center they just invested millions in may be worth almost nothing if students can't enjoy it. And students may not place a lot of value on that.
That's right. I mean, we, so many schools have built these very, very elaborate and sometimes extravagant physical plants. And if those are lying idle, that's going to be a big problem. And so, I, for one, have no idea what the fall is going to bring in this regard. It's just one question out of, so many in the context of this entire crisis. And I think, nobody can, all we can do is just make educated guesses as to how all this is going to shake out. But again, I will emphasize, I think there is the possibility for long-term structural changes of various kinds to end up getting driven by this crisis.
Yeah, no, I certainly think it will accelerate a lot around online learning, online education. I mean, I was already using Zoom for the past year and a half, but now it seems like everybody's using it. And they're finding, I think in many cases, because it's happened across education, K to 12, undergrad, and higher ed, a lot of folks aren't going to go back. That's the
Yeah,
crazy thing.
it was interesting when I mean, as many people have observed, like the last month has seemed to have taken a couple of decades to crawl by. I mean, we had a meeting at the law school, a lunchtime meeting, I think about 4 weeks ago now, in which we were just introduced to the concept of Zoom, something with which I think very, very few people on the faculty even knew existed. That was also true at the University of Colorado in general, because I blogged about it, and then I had people from other departments contacting me saying, "What is this Zoom thing?" And then literally 3 days later, the entire university had moved its teaching, this 30,000 student major research university, to a platform in which 99% of the faculty had literally never used it before. And it's an emergency situation, right? But at the same time, it was a, shall we say, awkward transition.
Of course. And from the student perspective, if someone's going to start law school in the fall and they're being asked to shell out full price tuition for an 1L education with professors who may not be familiar and maybe somewhat awkward in the Zoom setting, what's a student to do? How are they supposed to navigate going to law school, yes or no? But more specifically, I mean, I did another poll in the community. Most students said they would still go to 1L this fall, even if it were online.
Oh,
So
that's
let's
very
first say,
interesting.
surprising. Yeah, I was surprised myself. But so given they're going to go in the fall, if it may be online, how should they be deciding which schools to go to? How do they evaluate that decision, given, again, all the uncertainty?
Well, I mean, I think, since my sense of this, although I certainly haven't done any scientific study of it, but my sort of generalized sense of it is that pretty much all law schools are similarly sort of disadvantaged in regard to using distance technology for the most part. If law schools are using distance technology, then I don't think that in and of itself is going to have much, if any, meaningful distinction basis for students to make decisions, right? Since if everybody's more or less in the same boat, then students will have to make the decisions that they would have made previously, with the caveat, of course, that they have to ask themselves the question: are they willing to pay as much for distance learning as they would for in-person learning, which, as your poll indicated, a lot of prospective students are obviously very resistant to that. So the good news, such as it is that law faculty, needless to say, are vastly more familiar with distance learning now than they were 3 weeks ago. And there's a very steep learning curve here. I mean, I myself have experienced how the first half hour of teaching a distance learning class for the first time was kind of disastrous, because I mean, it wasn't just the faculty, it's also most of the students who had never used it before either. But after a couple hours, everybody's kind of getting the hang of it, and depending upon the kind of class you're doing, it can work fairly well, which has some pretty striking long-term consequences for legal education, right? I mean, if you have a $65 million physical plant that ends up being not really necessary for maybe 80 or 90% of what you do, well, that has a lot of implications for the future.
Yeah, no, it's certainly, I mean, it's a sunk cost at that point. But I'm wondering, and we had a great question in the chat around this. Alexis was asking about training. So could you imagine over the summer, have you heard any talk of someone providing training to professors for them to better adapt to the online format? I know that this is obviously an emergency situation this semester, but they've got 2-3 months until the fall. Could something be done by then?
Oh, yeah, sure. And I will say that, for instance, at my law school, the IT team has been extremely helpful in offering its services to faculty to show us how to navigate Zoom and how to do different things with it. And certainly, I think law faculty should be sharpening their new skills over the summer in this regard, given that it seems likely to me that for a long time there's going to be a considerable uncertainty as to whether we're going to be having in-person classes in the fall or not. So yeah, we should definitely be doing all those things. I imagine Some schools will do them better than others, but unfortunately, from a prospective student's point of view, there's absolutely no way to tell which of those schools are going to be.
Of course, of course. Now, I'm wondering, given you wrote the book "Don't Go to Law School Unless," you've done a lot of critical analysis of legal education and its value proposition. I'm wondering if we could maybe formulate some questions that students might ask admissions offices as they make decisions about where to go to law school this fall.
Mm-hmm.
Given both the transition to potentially being online and then just in general with the economic situation right now that we're facing.
Right. So the question then is, how should students be making these evaluative decisions at present?
Or maybe like what questions might they want to ask an admission officer around employment outcomes given the economy at the moment, what kind of career support the schools are giving them, and then just in general, what kind of training they might be offering faculty?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be good to ask questions about what, if anything, a school is doing in regard to training faculty, how it's gearing up its IT resources in order to make distance learning actually work to the extent that it actually has to be used. As far as employment goes, here, unfortunately, I think law schools are pretty much just passive observers. Needless to say, career services offices can't do anything about what sorts of decisions legal employers are going to be making in regard to hiring. And I guess the one thing I would say from the perspective of a potential 1L is that the real crunch is probably going to hit the people who are graduating right now. And 3 years down the line, we'll probably be looking at a very different situation. Still, I think, again, the sort of basic questions that all prospective law students should be asking remain even more pointed at a moment like this. What are the employment outcomes? What kind of data do you have in terms of salaries in particular? And all of this taking place in a context in which, here I want to emphasize a big change that has taken place in legal academia since I wrote the book 8 years ago, which is there's way more tuition discounting now than there was at the beginning of the previous decade. This is something I want to emphasize to prospective students right now. Law school tuition now is essentially nominal in the sense that it's always up for negotiation. And at almost all schools, there's an enormous range in the tuition that people are paying at those schools, ranging from literally nothing up to all the way to sticker and everything in between. And students need to be much more savvy than they traditionally have been in terms of negotiating that range, and understanding that sticker prices like MSRP on a car lot, or actually it's much more radical than that, because students should be able to get, if they negotiate properly, massive discounts on tuition, something that was not the case not that long ago, in which massive discounts were actually quite rare.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think most students are not nearly well equipped enough to deal with this or negotiate. They feel like it would be rude to negotiate, and they don't recognize that it's simply a suggested retail price that actually many students, if not most, are actually not paying sticker. And if you're paying sticker, you're simply supporting all the people who got the discounts, who got the scholarships.
That's right. Only about 30 to 35%, maybe right now, students are paying sticker. That varies, of course, quite a bit from institution to institution, but at almost all institutions, except Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, essentially all of the tuition discounts are so-called merit-based. In other words, schools are buying LSAT scores and, to a lesser extent, GPAs, and the students have now an enormous number of resources available to them in terms of going online and figuring out, what are people paying at these different schools, at sites like Law School Numbers and things like that, where you can look up, what sort of discounts are people getting given the kind of numbers that they have. And then what you do is you collect a number of offers, and then you play them off against each other for the purposes of driving down the price that a prospective student has to pay. And remember, when you're applying, you're the buyer. Okay, you're the customer. You're the person who has the money, or who can borrow the money, as the case may be. And the institution is the one that has to convince you that it makes sense for you to give them your money. I would hope most people, when they went to buy a car, wouldn't think that it would be rude to try to get the best price possible on the car. They understand that the dealership is trying to sell the car at the highest price and you're trying to buy it at the lowest price. And naturally, that's going to cause potentially a certain amount of friction. And some people are uncomfortable with that. But in the law school context, you can sort of do that, speaking of distance learning, at a distance, right? You don't actually have to go onto the lot and be harangued by a, smooth talking salesman. You can do it by email and by phone call and so forth. And just, as a prospective student, educate yourself as to what people are paying with your particular numbers at that particular schools. You can get that information, and then if those numbers aren't satisfactory to you, well, get yourself some better numbers. And that's where the kind of stuff that you do comes in, right? I mean, an LSAT score is the most valuable thing that you have to sell to a law school. And the great thing, of course, is that unlike your GPA, your LSAT score is not set in stone. You can change it, and it will drive down the price of the law degree that you are considering buying.
Exactly. So to frame it a different way for students, they look at their numbers, their LSAT GPA, they go on Law School Numbers, which is a student-submitted data website. You're basically, students input their information, they input their scholarship offers, where they get in, where they get waitlisted and such. And so you can find students with comparable numbers, see what they ended up with, and then use that to inform your ask of law schools, combined with your research on the cost of living in the area, for example.
Right.
And expected cost of attendance, expected loans you would have to take out, your own personal financial situation, and the shopping around. Just like you might call up several dealerships in the area, you apply to several different law schools, and then you can play them against each other in a sense.
Yeah, that's right. And prospective students need to keep in mind that it is very much, as the expression is, penny wise, pound foolish, not to apply to a wide range of schools, including schools that you might not really be seriously considering at all, because offers are very valuable for the purposes of negotiation. You shouldn't be thinking, oh, I would never go there. You should be thinking, if I had an offer from X, could that be helpful for me in regard to the price that I have to pay at Y? That's something that, sometimes students will, the psychology is very human, but it's also very counterproductive to think, I don't want to pay, $150 in application cost to apply to this particular school, when that $150 might save you literally tens of thousands of dollars down the line in regard to the kind of offer you can get from whatever school you end up attending.
Exactly. And so collecting, the more offers you can get, the better. Someone in the chat, Pearl, is asking, she was planning on applying to 10 law schools. At what point does it become too much? Is there a certain number you could apply to that does become too much?
Well, I mean, I think that it makes sense to apply to any school that is within the range of schools that would take seriously an offer in regard to, let me try to rephrase that. Let's say you want to go, let me just use the school. Let's say you want to go to Vanderbilt, let's say. I would apply to every school that you could get into that is within close enough range to Vanderbilt that Vanderbilt would pay attention to an offer from that school. And you can, sort of figure out what that means in terms of looking at the offers that are available on Law School Numbers and things of that sort. So, I mean, that could easily be, 12, 15 schools perhaps. I mean, I don't want to put a hard number on it, but it should be enough so that you aren't like wasting potential valuable leverage in regard to negotiating with the school that you most want to get into. Because again, the amount of money we're talking about here could be enormous over the course of 3 years, right? So apply to, it's better to apply to too many schools than too few. If you apply to too few, you can't take that back in an application cycle. If you apply to what turns out to be more than an optimal number, well, you may have, quote unquote, wasted a few $100s, but you may have saved yourself, tens of thousands of dollars, right? So the equation definitely leans towards applying to more rather than less schools.
Exactly, because you might get that additional offer you can use to negotiate at another school.
Right.
Now, speaking about comparables, I want to just highlight that a bit more and go into more detail on what exactly a comparable school might be. So for example, UCLA wouldn't care about your offer from Fordham because it's on the opposite coast, not the same region, lower ranked school. But UCLA and USC are much more comparable. But you say that's a reasonable framing?
Oh yeah.
Or feel free to throw out a better one.
It's true that schools will take, to the extent that you have any kind of actual ties to the area, schools will take offers from other schools in the region, more seriously. Now, if you don't have any connection to UCLA, then there's no reason why they wouldn't treat an offer from Fordham as being a potential real competitive offer, because it's not a huge gap. I mean, UCLA is obviously higher ranked than Fordham, but it's not, they're not like on completely different tiers or anything like that. Obviously, an offer from USC would be much more useful for you in trying to get into UCLA than one from Fordham. But one from Fordham, could help as well. It's kind of within the range. If you can, the key thing here, I think, is convincing a school that you really want to go there, because they don't want what they don't want is to give you an acceptance and then have you not go there, because that hurts their so-called yield, rate. And that you will only go there for the right price. You have to convince them of both of those things, because they don't want to waste an offer on you, because that hurts them. But on the other hand, you don't want to pay more than you have to pay to go there, because you're going to have to make up the money that you pay to them on the back end. And one of the aspects of this entire business, of course, is that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty regarding what the back end is going to look like. You don't know what the legal economy is going to look like in a few years. You don't know what kind of grades you're going to get in law school. You don't know a lot of things that it would be great to know, but unfortunately there's no way to know them ahead of time. So that means the things that you can control, how much you are paying on the front end, is something that you have to really throw a lot of intellectual resources into doing your best to maximize, right? I mean, I often tell prospective students, when you are raising your LSAT by 2 or 3 points, you are paying yourself potentially literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. If you think of it as a job, you could be easily paying yourself $500 an hour to study for the LSAT, right? Instead of thinking of it as why am I putting so much effort into this? It is a learnable test that can fantastically change both the cost of law school to you on the front end and the benefit that you get on the back end. And
I could not agree more.
So, it's just something that it's remarkable that there's this thing that is the most important thing, which you actually have control of, because there's a lot of other things, of course, you don't have control of. People ask things like, well, how can I improve my extracurricular activities, like the year they're applying to law school or something like that? It's like, you can't really, unless you're going to win a gold medal in the Olympics or something. I mean, you basically can't, you can't make much of a difference in regard to the things that law schools care about. Law schools care about LSAT scores and to a lesser extent GPAs. Unfortunately, for most people, there's usually not that much they can do about their GPA by the time they're applying to law school. Well, maybe they can do something on the margin, but LSAT they can do a great deal about. And again, the thing is, you are in an extraordinarily important and fraught negotiation when you're going through this process. The one thing I would emphasize to all the potential students who are listening to this podcast right now is the following: you are not doing law schools a favor. Law schools are not doing you a favor by trying to get you to enroll. You are doing them a favor by enrolling. They need you. They need your scores and they need your money. Okay, so don't get mixed up about the situation because of the hierarchies that are involved, or you feel like, oh, I'm this mere supplicant, and you're the great prestigious institution. That prestigious institution goes out of business tomorrow if they don't get enough people to sign up. And this is that's a bit hyperbolic, but it's more true than it ever was before, given the tremendously tumultuous state of higher education in the United States right now, and law schools in particular. So, think like a hard-edged negotiator, not like somebody who's just, grateful to be, admitted into the club.
Exactly. I was just telling Crystal earlier before you joined us that law schools need you more than you need them. They've got to fill those seats. They have their fixed costs. They have their overhead. You could choose a different school and they get zero from you, or you could choose not to go at all, and then nobody gets any money from you potentially.
I remember that one of the really perverse structures of higher education in America is that most institutions of higher education have no skin in the game. If you end up paying far more for something than it was worth to you, it doesn't hurt them. It only hurts you. Now, that could be changed in a variety of ways, and maybe it will be changed. But for right now, it's not that situation. Right now, the situation is 100% of the risk is on you. It's not on the institution at all. So keep that in mind before you sign, on the dotted line anywhere.
Exactly. And I'm really glad all the work you did previously to bring to light the issues in terms of the ROI students are getting from law schools. There's been so much more awareness among students around employment outcomes in the 509 reports. I've seen people in the chat here, they're just flooding it with advice and resources around looking up 509s, looking up the data on law school transparency around employment outcomes, JD required positions and such. And so I'm wondering if you could highlight a couple of the key data points and stats available out there that students might want to be looking at on different schools, the kind of stuff that LST puts out, but maybe you could just call attention to a few of those and explain them a little bit for folks.
Okay. The single most important statistic to look at is how many people are working in full-time jobs that require a law degree 10 months after graduation. That's the most basic number. Those are legal jobs. They're full-time long-term. That means they last for at least a year or longer. So they include things like judicial clerkships. How many people are getting jobs broadly defined as lawyers 10 months out of law school? That's the number one thing to be looking at. And that will vary enormously across schools. Now, you do get some, weird effects, kind of the very top end of the business. It's like a place like Yale, that number will be relatively lower because a bunch of people are going to save the polar bears or work for McKinsey or something like that. But that just doesn't apply to the vast majority of law students, right? But at most schools, that's the key number. The second most important number, and this one is harder to get because it's not available on the 509s for the most part, is what's the salary data look like? And there you have to be just hard-headed about getting that information out of career services, saying, I want to know how many of your graduates do you have salary data for 10 months after graduation, and what is that salary data? If a school won't give you that data, forget it. Just don't consider them. And good schools will give you that data because they know that that's a completely legitimate question.
Right. And so we've got the data from last year, let's say, from 2019's graduates. Now, 2020's graduates, the situation may be a little bit funky in part because as someone put in the chat, the bars are being postponed in a lot of states due to coronavirus. And so how might you expect for someone who's watching or listening to this several months from now when the 2020 data comes out, or next year when it comes out, how might one want to interpret the 2020 graduates data, given both the economy in general and then the fact that bars are being postponed?
Well, here's where it's really good to look at a spread of years, and it's great that the 509s and LST and those kinds of sources do have a number of years of data available. The 2020 data is obviously going to be very heavily affected by what the very strange things that are going on right now. That very much has to be taken into account. I would give this general piece of advice to people who are considering law school right now. It would probably be prudent if you have got any kind of reasonable alternative, I think, to maybe let things shake out a little bit. I know we're kind of late in the cycle already and so forth, but we're going to have a vastly clearer idea of the answers to a whole bunch of things 6 or 8 months from now than we do now. Now, I realize that, some people are in a position where they can't wait. If you're in that position, you basically have to roll the dice. You have to say, I just have to go on the basis of the information that is available to me now, knowing that information may look very different a year from now. But that's something that you got to go into with your eyes, wide open, because of the extreme sort of flux of the present situation. I understand that summer recruiting has been canceled at a very large number of schools, because of the COVID-19 epidemic. That's kind of like the most important piece of information in regard to students who are actually in law school, like who are getting what jobs at the time that they're in school. That whole thing has been turned upside down by the current crisis. I just want to sympathize with everybody who's considering applying right now. it's just an incredibly difficult situation, both for the applicants and for the schools and for, the whole system, for the legal employers who are trying to figure out, like, how much business are we going to be bringing in, 6 or 12 months from now, and how many people will we need to service our clients, et cetera. It's a very difficult time.
It's a really complicated situation, and there's not really a lot of clear answers for anybody in terms of going, not going. Should they relocate for law school? Will it be online? Will it be in person? Lots of open-ended questions, not a lot of answers. But I think, as you said, it's a roll of the dice. But folks might be questioning whether to go. I think waiting to see how things shake out is a reasonable course of action. But the question is, what are folks supposed to do instead, especially for those who are graduating seniors from undergrad this spring semester? Mm-hmm. Obviously, hardly anybody's hiring right now. And so going to law school to wait it out may seem a reasonable course of action.
Right. And this goes back to this point about higher education, and especially professional and graduate education being countercyclical. People will go into it sometimes because it's just hard to get a job, and that makes the immediate opportunity cost of going to school lower than it otherwise would be. That's something that often I think is the one piece of this whole equation that tends to get understated by a lot of the people who give advice in this area. It's very important to calculate what's my opportunity cost. What is it going to cost me in terms of foregone income to go to law school for 3 years? That varies enormously, of course. For some people, it's working as a barista for 3 years. For other people, it's throwing aside a very well-paying career that they're already in. So that makes it for a completely different calculation. For people who are graduating from undergrad right now, well, you're absolutely right. It's a situation where very often they may be looking at what looks to be not very good options at all, and they can think of as law school as maybe a kind of alternative / refuge from the tremendous stress and uncertainty of the employment market. Do keep in mind, however, that refuge comes with a big price tag, and the key is to make sure that the price tag can seem reasonable given the range of realistic potential outcomes. And that requires a lot of self-discipline on the part of applicants.
Right. And so this comes back to what we were saying earlier about negotiation, getting that high LSAT score as leverage, getting other offers as leverage to drive down the cost of the law school tuition, so that even though your opportunity cost might have been fairly low, you can still keep your debt as low as possible for those 3 years.
That's
now, we had a great question in the chat around, back to the question of looking at the employment data, the stats for 2020 and beyond, because maybe things won't get that much better in a year. How might we look at the 2008 to 2010 employment numbers from the recession and compare them, or at least use them as a benchmark to compare in some way?
Well, that's a really excellent idea. I mean, that's the last time that we went through a real serious employment crisis. And those numbers, I mean, the one difficulty here is that numbers for the graduating classes of 2010, 2011, are sometimes a little bit harder to get a hold of than for more recent classes, but it's worth doing for sure, because they can serve as a good benchmark in regard to the kind of range that you're looking at, with numbers that are far lower at a lot of really excellent schools than they are today. That's just the nature of the beast, right? And of course, the question that people who are considering going in the fall right now want to know is, what are the numbers going to look like in 2023? And the answer is, we don't know. But it's a good thing to keep in mind. Optimism bias is a very powerful distortion that people have. They'll tend, if you look at a range of employment outcomes, the natural human tendency for most people is to look at the top end and go, oh, okay, well, that looks good. But the more rational approach is say, well, let's look at everything from like best case to worst case scenarios, and then try to make a rational calculation given that there's a real range of possibilities here, as opposed to just assuming that like the best outcomes are the ones that will be most salient.
Right. No, I think that most folks, everyone assumes they're going to be in the top, and in reality, the majority are going to end up somewhere around the middle. And you can't assume you're going to be you can't necessarily assume you're going to be at the top. Everyone tends to think that. And that's actually where a lot of those conditional scholarships from law
Right.
schools come in. They play on that fallacy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
could
And
you
I
speak a
would,
little bit to conditional scholarships?
well, conditional scholarships, I would be very leery of ever going to a school that even offers conditional scholarships. That's something that has basically disappeared at almost every school that is, for most people, a potentially reasonable option. Although, there can be exceptions. But the conditional scholarship is a red flag.
Yeah.
It's something I would be very, very, very leery of, because if prospective students will often ask me, well, what are my odds of being in the top 10% of the class? And I'll tell them that's a real simple calculation. They're 10%.
But how
And
many got those offers?
that's right. And that's what that's how you have to calculate it. And so I'd be very, 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 very leery of conditional scholarships. And again, you can always improve your statistics. You can always get yourself better offers by getting yourself better numbers. Law school isn't going anywhere. At least we in legal academia are hoping right now that law school isn't going anywhere in any, sort of massive structural way. Without being, facetious about it, most people who are considering going to law school have a very long time horizon. They're thinking about a 30, 40-year career, and it doesn't make a big, it doesn't usually make a really big difference whether they're starting this year or the next or what have you. The key thing is put yourself in a good position, because it's a lot easier to get a high score on the LSAT than it is to get an A on a law school exam. Because you get a lot of mulligans on the LSAT. You don't get any on a law school exam. And again, you're talking about an educational system where in most first-year classes, which are by far the most critical classes, your entire grade depends on a single exam at the end of the year. And if you have a bad day, or the professor asks questions that just didn't really mesh with what you had studied or something like that, there's nothing you can do about it. You have to be realistic. Unlike the LSAT, where you can just keep taking it essentially until you get a score that gives you the kind of numbers that you need to do what you want to do. And here, let me just quickly reference, it's very, very important that people who are considering going to law school think about realistically what they actually want to do. I mean, if your real goal in life is to be a public defender in a small town in the Midwest, if that's genuinely your goal, it makes that has a completely different set of considerations in going to law school and how much you should pay for it than if your goal is to work for a big law firm in New York City. And both of those things are perfectly legitimate career goals, but people who are pursuing them ought to have very, very different attitudes in regard to what they're looking for in law school.
That's a really good point. You have different goals in terms of where you need to go to law school and how much debt is worth taking on,
right,
given the expected salaries upon graduation.
Right.
Now, back to conditional scholarships, there was a great question around how those are affected given law schools are going pass-fail.
Well,
that problematizes things, doesn't it?
About that. I hadn't thought of the effect of that on conditional scholarships. That's a really good question. The schools that are, since almost everybody seems to be going to pretty much strict pass-fail, I would think that would pretty much get rid of any loss of conditional scholarships in this particular academic year. I haven't thought this through, but if you're, actually, I shouldn't, perhaps I'm speaking too quickly in that regard, but let's put it this way. If they're going to take away conditional scholarships on the basis of first semester grades when there are no second semester grades, that sounds like a lawsuit waiting to happen to me.
No, I would think there's going to be a class action coming because the law schools are the ones changing the terms.
That's right.
in this situation.
That's right.
It's a pretty interesting complication here. As I guess we see, when you change one thing, it has a whole ripple effect, right?
That's right.
So what else should we be talking about in this situation right now, either around the economy with the pandemic, around just factors in general to be considering? What other thoughts are on your mind at this point in time?
Well, there's a lot of thoughts on my mind, and I'd like to just leave you with the following thought. There is, I think, a real possibility that the things that are happening right now will have profound structural effects on the economy, on education, on intergenerational equity, on all kinds of really fundamental political and economic and social questions. Law school is just a small piece of that, but it's our piece of it. But the world is being changed, I think, in drastic ways by what's going on right now. And I think higher education will be changed in drastic ways in the long run by what's going on right now. I think it may look very different 5 and 10 years from now than it did in the before time, i.e., 4 weeks ago, basically. So, I think that's where we are.
Certainly, lots of changes coming, and folks just need to keep their finger on the pulse and see what happens as things unfold.
Right.
But thank you for joining us, Professor Campos. I really appreciate your taking the time. Stay safe out there.
Yeah, thanks. Same to you.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.